for the lectures on medieval aesthetic theories, I depend on Umberto Eco, and the book is known as Art and Beauty in the Middle Ages. I hope you are seeing the book. Are you seeing it? So, Art and Beauty in the Middle Ages, it's available online for free. You can download it. It is also available on archive.org. So, you can get the book. You can either borrow the book and read, or you can get it downloaded by some means. So, Art and Beauty in the Middle Ages. So, Umberto Eco is a scholar on medieval aesthetics, and he has written several books on the same theme. So, this is the book I have referred to for the portion on medieval aesthetic theories. So, whatever I say will be found in this book also. We are going to see the medieval aesthetics of proportion, aesthetics of light and color, aesthetics of symbolism and allegory. So first of all, we will be seeing the aesthetics of proportion. When you look at the medieval art or architecture, proportion had a value. The idea of proportion was very dominant in medieval aesthetics. So if you look at the scale of architecture, that scale was the architectural scale as a basis of emotion. They consider architectural scale as a basis of emotion. So our response to the architecture comes in different ways. Suppose you are entering in a huge Gothic cathedral. When you are inside, you feel like you are in front of God. Why? You feel yourself very insignificant and very minuscule in front of the huge, gigantic architecture. When you go to the big temple, Brihadeshwara temple in Tanjore, you feel the same. When you are in front of it, you are too small. Even the plinth of the temple is too high. Maybe 2 or 3 people high, I think. So that tall is the temple. So you feel yourself insignificant and minuscule. So architectural scale is understood in that manner. So when the scale of architecture is increasing, we become smaller and smaller in relation to that. So suppose maybe in your room it is a human scale, maybe some 10 or 11 feet. Usually the buildings that are made for living have that height, like 10 or 11 feet high. But when it is a church, when it is a temple, it becomes even taller, too tall. That you become the believer who is inside becomes very insignificant. So that kind of importance is there for proportion. Very often you find larger than life proportions for sculptures and such things. And they also apply hieratic scale. If you look at the medieval art, you find hieratic scale. Hieratic scale you also find in Egyptian art, you find it. In Egyptian art also you find hieratic scale. So hieratic scale means, you know it? Do you have any idea of hieratic scale? What is hieratic scale? Anybody knows? Hieratic scale. Means the literal meaning is like it is something about priestly or sacerdotal. That is the literal meaning of hieratic. In our terms, it means the more important personalities will be given a larger scale, and the people with lesser importance, figures with lesser importance, will be given in smaller scale accordingly. So if you look at Narmer's palette, you find Narmer as a tall figure, and all other figures are too small. The enemies or all other figures are too small. In the Madonna before Renaissance, during the late medieval period, if you see it, if you look at some of the Madonna paintings, you will find Mother Mary as a very huge figure, and the apostles are smaller, and maybe some of the patrons, they will be even smaller. So that is a hieratic scale, and that proportion was used to bring about a mystical quality, or to give you a feeling of wonder or something miraculous. Some of the architectural constructs, even today we feel like it's a miracle. How could people build that? So that sense of miracle, sense of amusement, it is all there in the proportion. Proportion was used to create these kinds of emotions. So we have to understand the aesthetics of proportion little more clearly. So when you understand when we try to understand the aesthetics of proportion, you have to remember in the past lecture we have seen Plotinus, how he is understanding beauty. So he is refuting the idea of beauty as symmetry and proportion. So he takes the conventional definition of beauty and criticizes that. So you have to remember the definition. So most of the early medieval or late ancient scholars, they had an idea that beauty is symmetry and proportion. So we have two of them here. I will just show you the slide. Saint Augustine, he says, a harmony of its parts with a certain place in color is the beauty of the body. So what is the beauty of the body? He answers, a harmony of its parts with a certain place in color is the beauty of the body. And in Cicero also we find almost a similar definition. In the body, a certain symmetrical shape of the limbs combined with a certain charm of coloring is described as beauty. So actually they were summing up the Stoic and classical tradition of the past. That we find different definitions, different kinds of understanding about beauty, and in these definitions they are summing it up. Plotinus was a man who lived before Saint Augustine, so this definition was already there and there. So they are summing up the concept of beauty in their own definitions, which was already there. They are summing it up in their own definition. So the most ancient and best established concept in this aesthetic was that of congruence, of proportion or a number. So congruence means similarity or correspondence. So if you look at your palms, if you open your hands and if you look at your palms, there is a similarity between both your palms. There is a congruence between both your palms. And when you look at the human race as a whole, if you look at any human being, a man who is having a palm of this length will have a head or face of a particular length. So suppose if the palms are too small and the head is too big, it goes out of proportion. It runs out of proportion. Or if the palm is too long or too large and the head is too small, that is also a wrong proportion. So there is a kind of proportion that is operative in every human being when it comes to the form of human beings. This kind of concept, it goes back to pre-Socratic times. Means it is a quantitative conception of beauty. That kind of conception of beauty is a quantitative conception of beauty. So it is essentially quantitative conception of beauty, which is cropped up again and again in Greek thought. So this understanding of beauty is there even before Socrates. If you look at Pythagoras, Protagoras, Plato, Aristotle, this theory is being refined. And the most classical formulation is found with a person, with a sculptor. I hope you know the name. Do you know Polycletus? Who is Polycletus? Polycletus. किसी को पता है कौन है Polycletus? Polycletos or Polycletus? Can someone say? Who is Polycletus? He is a Greek sculptor, Polycletus. So in the canon of Polycletus, we find a classical formulation of this theory. So this theory is not a new thing. Even before Socrates, this kind of understanding of beauty was there. Beauty as symmetry and proportion. And it was refined in the thinking of different philosophers like Pythagoras, Protagoras, Plato, Aristotle. So it is being refined. And the most classical formulation of the same is found in a canon of Polycletus. In the canon of Polycletus, he was a 5th century BC sculptor, a sculptor from 5th century BC. Galen is also a man, a Roman citizen. So he refers to the canon of Polycletus. He lived in the late 2nd century or early 3rd century he lived. And he in his exposition of Polycletus doctrine, he refers to that, and that is available to us. Galenus is Claudius Galenus of Pergamum. Claudius Galenus of Pergamum. Claudius Galenus of Pergamum from 129 to 200 or 216 AD. That fragment available to us from the canon of Polycletus that says the beautiful comes about little by little through many numbers. The beautiful comes about little by little through many numbers. This is a part of his canon. And if you want to read more about the canon of Polycletus and writings of Galenus, you can refer to Erwin Panofsky, the meaning in the visual arts. Meaning in the visual arts. It's an essay by Erwin Panofsky. You can refer to that if you want to know more about canon of Polycletus. This is the most ancient established concept. Is the most ancient and established concept in this aesthetic was that of congruence or congruentia, of proportion or a number, a concept whose lineage went back to pre-Socratic times, and it was expressed essentially a quantitative conception of beauty, which cropped up again and again in Greek thought, in Pythagoras, in Plato, in Aristotle, and received the classical formulation in the canon of Polycletus, and in Galen's subsequent exposition of Polycletus doctrine. The canon of Polycletus was actually concerned largely with practical and technical issues. So Polycletus was writing about practical and technical issues in this regard. But when it gets into the Pythagorean speculation, it ended up in buttressing a dogmatic philosophy of art and beauty. So he speaks about, it turns out to be a theory of art and beauty. He was more concerned about the issues, he was more concerned largely about the practical and technical issues in creating works of art. But it turns out to be a theory of art and beauty, a dogmatic philosophy of art and beauty. And the fragment that is extended to us today that says the beautiful comes about little by little through many numbers. So Claudius Galenus of Pergamum, or you remember Galen at least, beauty does not consist in elements. He says beauty does not consist in elements, but in the harmonious proportion of the parts. Beauty does not consist in elements, but in the harmonious proportion of the parts, the proportion of one finger to the other, of all the fingers to the rest of the hand, and of all parts to other parts. So there is a proportion between this finger and the other fingers. There is a proportion between this finger to the palm. There is a proportion for this palm to this hand, and there is a proportion for this hand with this hand. There is a proportion for both the hands to the rest of the body. So each of the organs, they have a proportion, and it is a proportionate relation to the rest of the body, and that is how Galen's exposition of the Polycletus canon goes. So beauty does not consist in the elements, but in the harmonious proportion of the parts, the proportion of one finger to the other, of all the fingers to the rest of the hand, of all parts to all others, as it is written in the canon of Polycletus. So this line of thinking generated a simple and universal aesthetic theory, one that articulated a formal, almost mathematical concept of beauty. So it's a very formal concept of beauty. It is a quantitative understanding of beauty. It's a mathematical concept of beauty. Its many variations are reducible to one fundamental principle of unity in variety. So that's where you have to remember Plotinus again. So in that case, only whole can be beautiful. That is the argument of Plotinus, not parts. So because it is a complex or a composite unity of a composite thing. So in order to understand Polycletus a little more better, I will take you to a small video which I will play online. So in this website you will find a video and it says you what is beauty according to Polykleitos and explaining using his own terms a sculpture made by him, Doryphoros or Spear Bearer. We'll just look at the video.
What is perfect? Well, the ancient Greeks thought the human body was perfect. But for them, it was not an individual that was perfect. It was like almost mathematical precision where the proportions of every part of the body were perfect in relationship to the others.
We're looking at an ancient Roman copy of a Greek bronze original by the great artist Polykleitos, who sought out to demonstrate just that. What would perfect ideal beauty be? Thinking about the mathematical relationship of each part of the human body to the other and in relationship to the whole.
This is a sculpture called the Doryphoros. Doryphoros means a spear bearer, and he would have originally been holding a bronze spear. We call it the Doryphoros. Polykleitos apparently called it cannon, not to mean a piece of armament, but a kind of idealized form that could be studied and replicated. That is, a set of ideas that you followed.
The idea that you could create a perfect human form based on math was really part of a bigger set of ideas for the Greeks. If we think about Pythagoras, for example, Pythagoras discovered that harmony in music was based on the mathematical relationship between the notes.
In fact, Pythagoras tried to understand the origin of all beauty through ratio, and so it follows that the Greeks would be looking for that in one of the forms that they felt were most beautiful, that is the human body. The Greeks would perform their athletics nude, celebrating the body and its physical abilities. But even when they represented figures in noble pursuits like this figure, we have a figure whose clothes have been taken off. This is not because soldiers went into battle nude in ancient Greece, but because this sculpture is not about warfare. It's not a portrait of an individual. This is a sculpture that is about the perfection of human form.
This was found in a palestra in Pompeii, a place where athletes would work out, perhaps as a kind of inspiration for them.
So that's another layer of meaning. The Romans loved Greek art and had it copied in marble very often. And even in a city like Pompeii, we've found thousands of sculptures that are copies of ancient Greek originals. This is based on a sculpture that is at the very beginning of the classical period, before the Parthenon sculptures, but it's after the archaic figures. It's after the standing figure that we know as the Kouros. Here, the Greeks have turned away from the stiff renderings that had been so characteristic of the archaic and have instead begun to examine the human body and understand its physiognomy. This is one of the classic expressions of contrapposto.
The Doryphoros stands on his right foot. His left leg is relaxed. The right leg is weight-bearing, but the left hand would have been weight-bearing with the spear. Similarly, the right arm is relaxed. So there's a sense of counterbalancing and harmony in the composition of the body.
In a Kouros figure, you have both feet firmly planted, although one leg is forward. But nevertheless, if you were to draw a line between the ankles, they would still be horizontal to the floor.
And in a Kouros, the figure is symmetrical.
Here, both of those things have changed. And you see that his left ankle is up, and so you have a tilt of that axis. The axis of the knees are tilted in the opposite way. The hips are parallel to the axes of the knees, but also tipped. And then look what happens as a result of that. In those earlier figures, there was a perfect symmetry and a perfect line that could be drawn down the center of the body. Here, there's a gentle S-curve, and you can see, for instance, that his right side is compressed compared to the left side, because the left hip is literally hanging down over that free leg. It's not being supported.
To complete that sense of balance and harmony, Polykleitos turned the head slightly, breaking that symmetry of the archaic Kouros figures. With the invention of contrapposto by the Greeks in the 5th century BCE, we have, for the first time in Western art history, figures who seem fully alive, as though they move in the world. They're like us.
This is a sculpture that is, for all of the complexity of what we just discussed, is simply walking. But the mechanics of the human body walking are incredibly complicated. Here we have a civilization that not only was interested in understanding through careful observation how the body moved, but were interested culturally in capturing that. And so we have a society that puts human potential at the center.
And creates figures who are not transcendent, who don't exist in a separate world, but who exist in our world. They're, in a way, ideal mirrors of ourselves.
Can you hear? Okay. I think it's clear to you. Means how that concept of proportion, symmetry, it is operative in making of a sculpture, and how it helps the ancient Greeks to achieve that kind of naturalism. So that the mechanics of the body, the mechanics of the movement of the body, it's all absorbed, and also they put it up in a sculpture. When they make a sculpture, they are able to apply it. Why? To the use of ratio and proportion. Pythagoras already found that in music you understand different notes by different ratios, different mathematical proportions. So in the same way, in any visual reality also this proportion and ratios can be applied very perfectly. So that's how they achieve that kind of naturalism during that time. And this is important for us because I took a text from the ancient times and it is applied in the medieval period because these texts becomes very significant in the medieval period as well. So Polycletus, the exposition of canon of Polycletus, and it exerts influence into the medieval period also. So the proportion becomes very important. And in the first class, in the first lecture, I already referred that they were looking to the classical period for inspiration. The classical period, ancient classical people were looking at nature, looking around in the nature for inspiration, whereas the medieval people are looking towards the tradition they inherited, the classical tradition they inherited for inspiration. So, these people of the ancient times exerts their influence again in the medieval period. And that's about Polycletus. He is a source of the aesthetic theory of proportion and symmetry. So that's why I wanted to name him and speak about him. Polycletus and Claudius Galenus of Pergamum are sources of aesthetic theory of symmetry and proportion. And there is one more guy whom you would know. I'll just show. He is also very important in the discussions of beauty as proportion or aesthetics of proportion. Do you know this guy? I'm showing you an image. Do you know this man? If somebody knows, please say. Who is this? I don't think you will be able to find his name if you don't specifically remember or if you specifically know this iconography. I'll show you another image. Do you know this? Who is this? I have shown a second image on the screen. Who is that? Vitruvius, Da Vinci, Vitruvian man. We got all the three answers that I wanted. So that is a drawing by Da Vinci of Vitruvian man. And Vitruvian man comes from the writings of Vitruvius. So the first image I was showing, that is Vitruvius. He was a Roman soldier. So Vitruvius was a Roman soldier. He was also an architect, and he wrote maybe the first of the architectural theories in a book called De Architectura. He was a Roman military architect, and he wrote a book on architecture. Actually, it's a compendium of 10 books of architecture. So the illustration is of Vitruvian man, which Da Vinci has drawn, and it was drawn based on the writings of a man called Vitruvius. So Vitruvius and Vitruvian man are different. Vitruvian man is an illustration based on the writings of Vitruvius about the ideal proportions of a man. So you understand the difference, Vitruvius and Vitruvian man. He has written a book called De Architectura. De Architectura. And it's a book on architecture, published as 10 books on architecture, a treatise on architecture written by the Roman architect and military engineer Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, that's his name, and he lived in 1st century BC. And the book is dedicated to Emperor Caesar Augustus. as a guide for building projects. So it is actually a guide for building projects during the BC first century and AD first century, and even later. The Roman Empire was taking up huge architectural projects. So it was a guide for architectural projects. So it is another source of medieval theory on proportion. So medieval theory of proportion was Vitruvius. One of the older sources of medieval theory of proportion is also it's Vitruvius. And to know the history of the book, he wrote this in the first century BC. But this book was somehow lost. It was not available, or nobody speaks of this book for a long period. And in some of the writings from 9th century AD, since 9th century AD onwards, when some of the scholars write, they constantly cited Vitruvius in some philosophical and technical manuals. Vitruvius is cited by many authors. In some of the philosophical and technical manuals, you find citations from Vitruvius since 9th century onwards. And he supplied us with the vocabulary like proportion, symmetry, etc. Means in that period, in that particular period from 9th century, the citations from him was giving words like proportion, symmetry, etc. And also different formulations of the aesthetics of proportions were also found in those citations. So that book was not available to us for a long time, though the citations are found from 9th century onwards. And according to Vitruvius, proportion consists in taking a fixed nodule, in each case both for parts of a building and for the whole. Or again, he defines proportion as the appropriate harmony arising out of details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail among the separate details to the form of the design as a whole. This is what he says about proportion. So Vitruvius writes, for instance, proportion consists in taking a fixed nodule, in each case both for parts of a building and for the whole. Or again, he defines proportion as the appropriate harmony arising out of the details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail among the separate details to the form of the design as a whole. So this is his understanding of proportion, or this is his understanding of beauty. So something made like this will be beautiful. We are all practicing artists, and I have done a painting degree for bachelor's in Kerala. So when we are doing study from life, when we are doing life studies, very often one of our teachers will come and say, we usually have a habit of taking a pencil, I have a ruler here, and holding our hands like this, we just measure, take the proportion. Do you remember that? As students of art, when you are practicing, when you are doing a life study, or when you are doing a nature study, you take your pencil and put your hands straight and close one of your eyes and take the proportion on your pencil. And you mark on the drawing sheet and you make a line. Again, you take another proportion. Means how long are the hands, how long is the head, how long is the torso, how long is the leg. So you do that with a pencil. One of our teachers used to come and say, don't do that. You don't need to do that. You just, in your mind you have to have it. So when you start drawing, if you draw one eyebrow, so it has a proportional relation to the rest of the face. So if you draw one eyebrow, you just calculate how many eyebrows is the forehead. Or if you draw the eye, if you mark the eye, how much is the gap between these two eyes. So each organ of your body has some kind of proportional relation between all of them. So you don't need to take a pencil and measure all the time. And you don't miss. And if you have learned to do life drawings from books on anatomy, means anatomical drawing, there are many books available. If you follow those books, he also says that if you follow those books, whoever you draw, you will have that kind of anatomy coming in. But we all know anatomy of different people are different. So the bookish anatomy may not be fitting to all the anatomy that you are drawing. So my anatomy may be different from that of yours. The physical features may be very different. So each person has his own proportions in his body, between the organs, between different organs of your body. So you don't need to measure it like this with a pencil. You just need to understand the length in your mind and have a calculation within your mind, in order that you will be able to draw him the most natural way as he appears. Okay, so that's where you have to understand this definition. Proportion consists in taking a fixed nodule, in each case both for parts of a building and for the whole. And he also goes on to define the appropriate harmony arising out of the details of the work itself, the correspondence of each given detail among the separate details to the form of the design as a whole. So there is another author, Vincent Bouvet. Vincent of Bouvet, he is a Dominican friar from the 13th century. He developed the Vitruvian theory of proportions of human figure in his Speculum Naturale. He developed the Vitruvian theory of proportions of human figure in his book called Speculum Naturale. Speculum Naturale means the mirror of nature. And that work is very Greek in spirit, for its collections of rules according to which the dimensions of a beautiful object are determined by relations among themselves. So if you take a beautiful object, if you see a beautiful object, it is beautiful because of the relations among themselves, the relations among themselves. So a flower vase or a pot, whatever it is, there is a proportion between its different organs. So that makes it beautiful. So dimensions of a beautiful object are determined by the relations among themselves, and rather than their relation to an abstract numerical unity. So you don't need to bring in an abstract numerical unity to means maybe 2 centimeter, 3 centimeter. That kind of measurement is not, abstract measurements are not required. It has a proportion between itself. And again, if you remember, in Indian architecture, when you read ancient Indian architecture or medieval Indian architecture, most of the time you cannot measure it by modern standardized measurements. Instead, you will have to go by the measurements like angula, hasta, means whose hand is it, whose hasta hai, kiska hasta hai, kiska angula hai, maybe of the chief architect. So it need not be a very standardized kind of measurement. With the different organs of the same architecture, it will have a relation, a proportional relation. Vincent of Bouvet, he says, he makes a measurement of man. A face is said to be 1/10 of the size of the body. A face is said to be 1/10 of the size of the body. Proportion here is conceived of not as something grounded in an abstract number alone, but as an organic and concrete harmony. So there is an organic harmony. It is not depending on number, but on an organic harmony. It was from these sources, means like that of Vincent Bois and also from Vitruvius. Means Vitruvius was cited in many medieval authors, cited by many medieval authors. So it was from these sources then that the theory of proportion descended to the Middle Ages. Okay, especially to the late Middle Ages. It was through these authors the concept of proportion descended to the Middle Ages. De Architectura, the book by Vitruvius, it was discovered in, the actual text was discovered in 1440. The text of Architectura was discovered in 1440. So since 9th century onwards, you see scholars citing Vitruvius in technical and philosophical manuals. In 1414, they discovered a manuscript of this text, and it had enormous impact on architecture, especially during the Renaissance period. And this is the only treatise on architecture that survived from ancient period. This is the only treatise that survived from antiquity, especially on architecture. So it has been regarded since the Renaissance as the first book of architectural theory. This is considered to be the first book of architectural theory. I mean the De Architectura by Vitruvius. And it is also the major source of the canon of classical architecture. The major source of the canon of classical architecture. But you have to understand that Vitruvius was a Roman soldier and he was writing on Roman architecture, and you have to remember that he wrote in 1st century BC. That is before the development of cross vaulting, domes, the use of concrete and other innovations associated with the imperial Roman architecture. So it cannot be regarded as a authentic source of information on imperial Roman architecture, because many of the later developments in Roman architecture happened after Vitruvius. So the Roman building design and technology, the hallmarks of Roman building design and technology is cross vaulting, domes, concrete. They are all considered to be the hallmarks of Roman building design and technology. These are not found in Vitruvius because he wrote much before these things were invented. And I will take you to a summary of the book of Vitruvius. You may please go to the text. These are only the titles of the books. There are 10 books of architecture, and these are only the titles of the book. You at least have in your mind the letters that are given in bold, the words that are given in bold letters. Book 1, it's on the architectures. It is book 1 on an architect's ideal education, the principles and divisions of architecture, fortifications, principles of good town planning, and where best to build a temple. And book 2 on the origins of buildings and the various materials employed in their constructions, such as bricks, sand, stone, and wood, and the various types of walls. Book 3 on the mathematics and correct proportions of columns and timbers. And book 3 is very important for us. Why it is more important for us? Because the Vitruvian man and most of the things that we speak about proportion comes in the 3rd book. That's why I want you to remember this always. Book 3 on the mathematics and correct proportions of columns and timbers. This book you have to remember. And there is a chapter in book 3. Chapter 1 of book 3. It is on symmetry in temples and in the human body. On symmetry in temples and in the human body. And this is the chapter where you find the Vitruvian man. And the association means the Vitruvian man is compared to architecture. Okay. And book 4, the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian architectural orders and the various types of temples and altars. And book 5 on various Roman buildings such as basilica, the best design for theatres to obtain best acoustics, and advice on building harbours. You know how advanced the Roman architecture is. They are thinking of acoustics and about building harbours. Book 6 on the effect of climate on character and best foundations and layout for private homes. On effect of climate on character and best foundations and layout for private homes. And book 7 on paving, walls and wall paintings, including the best colors and their origins in history of use. Book 8 is concerned with water, its sources and conveyance via aqueducts. Book 9 on the study of astronomy and its relevance to architectures and the measurement of time using sundials and water clocks. Book 10 describes various machines and gadgets like distance measuring devices, water driven machines and weapons like catapults, ballistae and siege engines. So this is the like a table of contents. This is a summary of the 10 books, what those 10 books deals with. This is an extract I am showing you. These paragraphs you are seeing is an extract from the very book. The book on mathematics and correct proportions of columns and timbers. And the chapter on symmetry, the first chapter of the book 3 on symmetry in temples and human body. So this is an extract. We can go through it, and this book is also available online for free. I shall also share the link in classroom so that you will be able to read it. At least that chapter you read. You don't need to read the whole book. At least that particular chapter You may please read. And if you go through that, without symmetry and proportion, there can be no principles in the design of any temple. That is, if there is no precise relation between its members, as in the case of those of a well-shaped man. So a temple is compared to a well-shaped man. If you remember Vastu Purusha in Indian tradition, it is compared to a well-shaped man. For the human body is so designed by nature that the face from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair is 10th part of the whole height. An open hand from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger is just the same. The head from the chin to the crown is an eighth, and with the neck and shoulder from the top to the breast to the lowest roots of the hair is a sixth. And it goes like that. You just go and read this. I insist that all of you should read that first chapter of book 3. You read it yourself. I don't want to spend time on reading that again. So it says the navel is the center and there are so many things said in that about the different proportions of different organs of the body. It says you just go and read for yourself. And coming to proportion, coming to the discussion on proportion, it is not only about architecture, sculpture and painting, it is also about music. The medieval theory of proportion is extended also to music. So there is a proportion of beauty that is seen in music. And one of the most important scholars who writes about that is Boethius, who wrote Consolation Philosophy. So there is a theory of musica mundana, or about mundane music, music of the mundane. So Boethius explained all of this in terms of theory of proportion. So aesthetic experience of music is grounded in the principle of proportion, according to Boethius. So that when we listen to music, we enjoy the music because that music has got a proportion. And this theory, that theory is known as musica mundana, or the mundane music, the music of the mundane. Mundane means of the world, the music of the world, which is related to earthly things. So the music of the material world. He explains it by a theory of proportion. The soul and body, he said, are subject to the same laws that govern music. So the human soul and body are subject to the same laws that govern music. And these same proportions are to be found in the cosmos itself. So the same proportions are found in the human body and soul, and the same proportions are found in music as well, and the very same proportions are found in the cosmos also. So that's the reason why we are able to enjoy a particular music. I can relate to that music because that proportion that is operative in that music to make it beautiful is also a part of my soul. That's why I am able to enjoy that particular music. So he says about microcosm and macrocosm. Microcosm and macrocosm are tied by the same knot, simultaneously mathematical and aesthetic. So man conforms to the measures of the world. Man conforms to the measure of the world and takes pleasure in every manifestation of this conformity. So do you know what is microcosm and macrocosm? What is micro and macro? What is macro and micro? Macro is large and micro is small and large. So what is the connection between that? I want you to conceive means the human body, and in my body there are so many organisms that are living. So many organisms are living in my body. Okay, so many microorganisms which are visible only through microscope is living in my body, and that makes my body. You understand? So I am the macrocosm and the microcosms are the small microscopic beings. And again you conceive, in the same manner I become a part of a larger body, or we all together or all these things together becomes a part of a larger body. You understand? So how these microorganisms are operative in my body, in the same way we are all operating in a larger body. So that is the understanding of microcosm and macrocosm. So there is a proportional relation that is found between the larger body which I spoke about, where I am a part of it, and again that relation is going deep down into the microorganism that is living in my body. And suppose, but we can speculate, in that microscopic organism, if you have larger or more powerful microscopes, you can find more organisms living and making that microorganisms. You understand? So that kind of relation he speaks about. Microcosm and macrocosm are tied by the same knot. And there's simultaneously mathematical and aesthetic. So man conforms to the measure of the world. And when I conform, when I realize the conformity to the in my own body, I find a kind of connection with a larger body or a smaller body. That connection creates a sense of beauty. So there is a music of the earthly beings, and the music that I listen to has a connection with that. So how can I explain it further? Means we love similarity. That's a statement of his in the book De Institutionae Musica. We love similarity and hate resent and dissimilarity. So when there is a similarity between what is in my soul, so okay, when there is a similarity for a piece of music with the music that is already in my soul, that similarity gives me an enjoyment. That similarity becomes the norm for judgment of that music as beautiful. Okay, I hope this is clear to you. One more thing I would say, and he is borrowing the theory of music of the mundane from the Pythagorean theory of music. So the Pythagorean theory of music we saw in brief in the lecture on Pythagoras, but we will have something more to add. So Pythagoras speaks of the music of the spheres. According to Pythagoras, the planets, they had 7 planets which are revolving around the earth. According to the ancient Greeks, in their understanding, there were 7 planets which were revolving around the earth. Earth was in the center for the ancient Greeks. So each planet makes a music, a pitch. It produces each planet according to the distance from the earth and the velocity in which it moves. In the velocity in which it moves around the earth, it makes a particular pitch. And each planet generated a knot of the scale, the pitch heightening according to the distance from the earth. So the farther it is, the pitch increases and it completes the scale. You know, we have Sari Gama Pada, I don't know how to sing. Sari Gama Pada Ni Sa. So each pitch is generated by these planets according to Pythagoras. So according to Pythagoras, each planet generated a knot of that scale. The pitch heightening according to the distance from the earth, according to that is to the planet's velocity. Together they produce the most exquisite music. So all of them together produce the most exquisite music. That is what he says, the music of the spheres. The music of the spheres. And this music, according to Pythagoras, cannot be heard by the human beings. Our senses are so inadequate that we will not be able to hear that music. Suppose there is an example, means dogs will smell anything. So we cannot smell everything that the dog may smell. So their sense of smell is more powerful than that of human beings. In the same manner, our senses are not powerful enough to listen to the music of the spheres. It can be understood only by contemplation or or on a higher level of being, only you will be able to understand it. Okay. This theory of the music of the spheres were further developed during the Renaissance. The Renaissance astronomers also held that the Earth moved from its premise so that it completed the scale by producing the eighth sound or the eighth note to complete the scale. So this is about the music of the sphere, and the music that we hear in the world on the Earth is a micro kind of music, a music of the smaller scale. I hope you understand that connection. And the Boytian conception of the proportion of the universe, this understanding of microcosm and macrocosm, this caught the imagination of the medieval people most. And there is also one more video that I wanted to show you in order that you understand the microcosm and macrocosm. That video is available on YouTube and it is known as The Powers of the Ten. It's a video art. It's a video art by Eames. Ray Eames and Charles Eames. Powers of the Ten. You can watch it for yourself later. I will give you the name of the video. And I shall also share it in the classroom. Powers of the Ten. So when you see that, you will have a connection. You will have an understanding of what microcosm and macrocosm is. Okay, so that is about the music of the spheres or the mundane music. And there is proportion in music. That's what you have to make clear. You have to understand clearly. And this theory of mundane, of the music of the mundane or musica mundana, it also leads to a more concrete conception of beauty. Like you see beauty in the cycles of the universe. Like there is regular movements in the universe, like the time, 4 seasons, the rhythms of nature, the motions and humors of biological life, and there is a total harmony that is found in the nature. Okay, so the theory of musica mundana leads also to a more concrete conception of the beauty in the cycles of the universe, in the regular movements of time and seasons, in the compositions of elements, the rhythms of nature, the motions and humors of biological life, the total harmony, in short, microcosm and macrocosm. So the music of the universe is the macrocosm, and the harmony that you found in the world is the microcosm. So that kind of understanding comes from the theory of musica mundana. There was another understanding with some other scholars of medieval period that they are not speaking about the proportion. Instead, they say form as the cause of beauty. So there is a formal element. Even though there is no proportional harmony in between them, the very form itself consists beauty. Everything means any object that is having a form has a beauty of its own. So they consider beauty as something more organic, not about mathematical, very rigid and complicated mathematical principles. So there is a form, organic nature, which is a cause of beauty. So according to the theory of the form as the cause of beauty, the rigid logic of mathematics is tempered by a sensitivity to the organic qualities of nature. So the nature has an organic quality. It is not counting 1, 2, 3 and growing. A plant when it grows, it does not have any mathematical logic when it grows. If you look at a plant when it grows, it does not count any number. Though we say beauty comes little by little through many numbers, that is by Polycletus. If you look at a plant that is growing organically, we don't see anything mathematical there. Or like Plotinus say in lightning, we don't see any proportion in lightning. So there is an organic quality. So according to them, beauty remains in the sensitivity to the organic qualities of nature. William of Conches, theory of charge, Bernard of Tours, Alan of Lille, they are the people who preferred not to speak of the immutable mathematical order. Instead, of an organic process whose nature was best explained by form. So the form as the cause of beauty. And they also say this in the background of Christian doctrines, because according to them, the second person of Trinity was the organizing principle of the aesthetic harmony. So if you know the Christian doctrine, there are, you might have heard, in the name of the Father, Son and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So Father, Son and the Holy Spirit. These are the three persons of the Godhead of Christianity. So according to the Christian doctrine, there is only one God, but there are three persons in one God. And these three persons are the person of God the Father, the person of God the Son, which is Christ, and God the Holy Spirit. So they considered Father as the efficient cause, the creator, and the Son as the formal cause, which gives beauty to everything. So the form as the cause of beauty, and Holy Spirit as the final cause towards which everything is going. So according to them, it was nature, not number, which governed the earth. According to Pythagoras, everything was governed by numbers, and most of the medieval thinkers are taking that position. So it was by number, proportion, symmetry, things are made beautiful. But according to these people, or people of their kind, William of Conches, theory of Chartres, Bernard of Tours, Alan of Lille, all these people held that it was nature, not the number, which governed the earth. So nature, the organic quality of nature was more important for them. And one of the advantages of this position is that even the negative features of the world, or even the ugly things in the world, they also found place in the scale of beauty. When you try to understand something beautiful, when you take a quantitative way of understanding beauty, like proportion, something that is not proportionate, that is ugly, that is not beautiful. But when you come to the organic, when you take the organic nature or the organic form as a cause of beauty, something that is less beautiful also comes in the scale of beautiful. There is nothing like ugly. You understand? Even ugliness has a place through proportion and contrast in the harmony of things. So suppose you say something is white because you know something that is black. You say something is white because you know something that is black. Or you understand the beauty of this white paper in comparison to something that is not as beautiful as this paper. You understand? So if you go like that, anything in the world can be beautiful. Maybe it is in a lower, on the scale it may be in the lower part, but everything gets a place. It is not discarded as something that is ugly. So in these and similar visions of cosmic harmony, many of the problems connected with negative features of the world found a solution. Even ugliness found its place through proportion and contrast in the harmony of things. It was the view common to all the scholastics that beauty was born out of contrast. So most of the scholastics, they thought that beauty was born out of contrast. So in order to say something is beautiful, you have to contrast it with something that is not so beautiful or not that beautiful. So even monsters acquired a justification and dignity. So only if there is a monster is there, an angel or the opposite of monster, something that is good, that beauty or goodness is more expressed. So even monsters acquired a certain justification and dignity from their participation in the music of creation. Evil itself became good and beautiful, for good was born from it. Because when there is evil only, we will know the goodness of good. When you lose eyesight only, you will know the value and goodness of your eyesight. And until then, you will not know how valuable your eyesight is. Beauty is shown out more brightly by contrast with what is. If there are two lights, the one which is what which is shown more brightly is understood only because there is a light that is shown dim. Okay, so that is another way of looking at the beauty in the medieval period. It is not of proportion but an organic quality. The concept of proportion as beauty is expressed in a thing known as Homo quadratus. Homo quadratus. It is a theory. The Homo quadratus is a theory which says, which literally means the squared man. A squared man. So it's again about the microcosm and macrocosm, and it is more closely related to the Indian concept of Vastu Purusha, Homo quadratus. So a squared man. As you know, the Vastu Purusha is also made to be fit in a square. Okay, if you remember the image. So it's something similar. So Macrobius writes, the world is a man writ large, and the man is the world writ small. You relate it to the understanding of microcosm and macrocosm. The world is man writ large, and the man is the world writ small. Writ means written. The world is man written large, and the man is the world written small. It's a statement by Macrobius. And it comes from the Pythagorean cosmology. Okay, this kind of understanding, the ideas are drawn from the Pythagorean cosmology. According to the theory of Homo quadratus, number is the principle of the universe, and numbers possesses symbolic meanings, which are grounded in correspondences at once numerical and aesthetic. Initially, the theory referred to music, but later it is extended to different other forms of art. So, a Carthusian monk who is anonymous, he said that there were 8 musical tones. 4 were discovered by the ancients and 4 by the moderns. So, the number 4 has got a significance. And as in nature, so it ought to be in art. The nature divides itself in quadripartite manner. So, nature divides itself in a quadripartite manner, 4 parts. The nature divides itself in a quadripartite means into 4 parts. There are 4 regions of the earth. There are 4 elements. There are 4 primary qualities, 4 winds, 4 conditions of the body, 4 virtues of the soul, so on and so forth. So, the number 4 is very significant. There is a common belief that number 4 has a fundamental significance, like 4 cardinal points, 4 winds, 4 phases of the moon, 4 seasons, 4 letters in the name Adam, and 4 was the constitutive of number of Plato's tetrahedron, which corresponded to fire. So number 4 was very important. And Vitruvius also considered 4 as the number of man. 4 as the number of man. Because the distance between his extended arms was the same as his height. So the height of the man and the length between the extended arms were the same. So for that reason he considered 4 as the number of man. So it gives a square structure. When the length and breadth are correct, when the length and breadth are the same, it gives the structure of a square. So for that reason, Vitruvius taught the 4 was the number of man. And 4 was the number of moral perfection also. And men experienced in struggle of moral perfection were called tetragonal. And again, Homo quadratus also was pentagonal. So there was pentagon means 5 sides. So Homo quadratus was also pentagonal. For 5 was another number of arcane significance, which symbolized mystical and aesthetic perfection. 5 was a circular number. 5 was a circular number. And there were 5 essences of things, 5 elementary zones, 5 genera of living creatures like birds, fish, plants, animal, men. And 5 was the number of divinity and was scattered to scriptures. Like in scriptures you find the book of Pentateuch where there are 5 books and 5 wounds. Jesus Christ had 5 wounds. So the dominance of Christianity is found in that kind of thoughts. And number 5 was also found in man, because the 4 extremities, if you stretch your arms and legs, the 4 extremities could be joined by lines, and it will give you 5 sides. Joined by 5, the extremities of human body were joined by straight lines, and they formed a pentagon. So 5 was important. And in many of the drawings of that time, like the image found in Villard de Honoport, and also in the much better drawings of Leonardo, you find that kind of pentagonal element. So that kind of allegorical significance of these numbers, that was also a way of understanding the medieval theory of aesthetics, or medieval aesthetic theory of proportion. And it was found also in literature, it was found in music, we already saw, plastic arts we already saw. These kinds of elements with allegorical significance found place in the construction of cathedrals, and also in different arts. I'll just show you some images and we are going to finish. What do you see? Turning next to the plastic and figurational arts, we find that the concept of symmetry was very common, mainly due to the influence of Vitruvius. If you look at the plastic and figurative arts, because of the influence of Vitruvius, the concept of symmetry was very important. Vincent of Beauvais, following his footsteps, wrote that architecture consists in order, disposition, eurythmy, symmetry and beauty. So Vincent of Beauvais wrote that architecture consists of order, disposition, eurythmy, symmetry and Beauvais, means following the footsteps of Vitruvius. So the Vitruvian man, not only the Vitruvian man, the whole text of Vitruvius was very influential in the medieval period, and you find that in the architecture of that period. I said about the number 5 as very significant. Actually, the church was not promoting such esoteric practices in the church, but the architectural guilds, they always followed certain practices privately, and that appears in the cathedrals and all. So there is a pentagonal motif that is found, like a star, and a 5-sided pentagon is found there. And not only there, in many constructs of that period you find this. This is another cathedral. Again, the motif of 5, a pentagonal motif is found in the center. The influence of Vitruvius, the proportion between different parts of the cathedral, different organs of the cathedral, between the parts and with the whole of the cathedral, the proportionate relation found between each organs, each elements of the architecture. This is about the pentagonal motif, I said, and this was the artist I referred to, Villard de Honoport. So maybe the pentagonal element is not drawn or not shown directly. It is hidden in some of the forms. Okay. When you look at medieval art, you find motifs like this. What is this? So this is a two-tailed mermaid, detailed from a Romanesque frieze. So why there are 2 tails? Usually we know the mermaid has only 1 tail, but why there is 2 tails? They are so they want to make sure that symmetry, the symmetry is followed, the rule of symmetry is followed. So that's why they make 2 tails. If you cut 1 tail, that symmetry is lost. So in a way, they are trying to follow the rule of symmetry when they are doing a sculpture. So in order to follow the rule of symmetry, the principle and criterion of symmetry, even in its most elementary forms, was rooted in the very instincts of medieval soul. It had influence even upon medieval iconography. So the iconography maybe that they derived it from Bible and liturgy, but they modified it in order to follow the rule of symmetry. Sometimes they even violate the most ingrained beliefs and most sacrosanct details. Sometimes, in order to keep the rule of symmetry, they may violate even the most ingrained beliefs and the most sacrosanct details. So, in some of the paintings, you will find one of the magi omitted because the third figure would have destroyed the balance of the composition. The magi visiting the infant Jesus in the nativity scene. I will show you an image. See, this is from Naturalis Historia, 1565. It's an illustration. So we know we don't find the mermaid is actually an imaginary being, but it is said to have only one tail. But there are two tails, so that it follows the criteria of symmetry. And again, two-headed eagle. And I did not find the particular painting referred to. But this one, do you see this painting? This Adoration of the Magi in 1520. Actually, in a reading I had from Umberto Eco, I found the third Magi is not presented because the third Magi would spoil the proportion. But I could not find that. But this is another painting I found. And in this you find the two Magi. And you know, conventionally, in the paintings of Adoration of the Magi, what you find is three Magi. Do you understand what I am trying to say? Do you understand? Adoration of the Magi, most of the time you find three Magi, three kings who visited the infant Jesus. And actually in the Bible it is not stated. The number 3 is not stated. 3 gifts were given. So there is a concept that there were 3 people who visited, 3 wise men. Okay, and in this only 2 are shown in the forefront, and one is made to stand behind the screen. And it is also possible that it can be Saint Joseph standing behind. There are only 2 Magi shown in front. So why? In order to keep the balance, symmetry. So the 5-sided star, or 5-petal rose, they all have some kind of esoteric significance, and the Masonic guilds used it on the basis of their rituals. Though the church was not promoting such things, it was being used there in the churches by the Masonic guilds, which were in charge of the building. This is about the aesthetics of proportion and symmetry that is found in the medieval period, in the Middle Ages. So we are stopping for today, and next day we will be seeing aesthetics of light and color.